This video is a follow-up to my last video on the Dawn Goddess, this time featuring her counterpart, the masculine Dawn God. I usually prefer to just dive into the topic, but this time I'm going to give a little bit of context. This is the map that I'll be using today of the Dawn God complex. It's part of a larger project of evolutionary mapping, as you can see here with this. I just did this episode. Eventually I can go into more depth about different facets of each one of these, but I have enough to show today about primarily West Asian Dawn God in the Middle East, which is like Ishtaran and Atar, then a little bit of Mithra around the sides. And I might hint at a few different slight little variants outside. Another piece of context is the other project I have going on. Me and my team work on comparative mythology, basically trying to catalog and organize family trees for every mythology period. So as you can see, it's quite extensive. And we don't get paid to do this. Really, we just do it ourselves for the passion, the love of it, but we do have charts that I make using the information that we get from these deep dives that we're doing. Each of these is a chart that's available on Studio Pandemonia and Gumroad. I have the links in my description. We have about 17 charts finished so far, so every bit of support matters and helps us continue to do this. And that's about enough for context, so let's get into it. So before we get into the details, I want to provide you with a short list of motifs that you can keep in mind when we're looking at these. So these are like signals, signs, symbols, ideas to watch out for. They are Dawn, Lightbringer, East, Venus, Justice, Order, Covenants, Love, Beauty, Youth, and White Horse. So those are all the main motifs that I'm going to bring up kind of consistently. I thought I would just give that to you so you can see a little more of what I'm seeing, maybe even go off on your own and provide more insight and more examples of the archetype that I'm investigating. So we're going to start by turning off this Mithra layer temporarily. There, much simpler, if you can call this simple. So with my last video on the Dawn Goddess, I talked about the hypothesis of where Ishtar came from linguistically, and one of the leading hypotheses is that there was a Semitic dawn god, Ishtar, Ishtaran, shining star, Ishtar, and that when the Semites came down the Euphrates and began to interact with the Sumerians in lower Mesopotamia, they adopted Inanna and many of her traits, then called her by a kind of feminine form of the name of their own Ishtar. I had come around to that hypothesis by the end of the video. However, one goddess I did not cover adequately in that video is Ishra or Asherah. It seems to me that that goddess is an older form of Ishtar that the Semitic peoples were worshipping before Inanna, before Ishtar actually. So the oldest records I could find really of this complex of deities in the Levant, of the dawn star god, is Ishtaran, which is kind of Akkadian. It's considered to be Sumerian. I'll cover this little corner in a second. But nonetheless, it seems to be around 2900s, 3rd millennium BC, that this dawn god was spreading into Levant. And of course, Inscriptions are in cuneiform. Cuneiform was developed by the Sumerians, so the Semites adopted writing in cuneiform from the Sumerians, so it could just be they already worshipped these deities and they were only inscribed. We only have record of them after Sumerian influence, so it's a coincidence. And I suspect they probably, like most people, had a general word and idea for Venus, for the shining star, as being just a word for the planet, and the planet is deified as it is basically globally. So, anyhow, the inscriptions nonetheless show that the Akkadian form is oldest, along with Ashtabil in Ebla. Ebla is one of the oldest Semitic cultures, kind of follows the Akkadian contact with Sumerian. The next phase would be Ugaritic, and then the most recent form is this Altar of Aramaic, Aramaean, and we see many forms. Canaanite right here, Ashtar, the Moabites, who fought the Israelites, and we've got Atar Shammai, and Samai, Shamain means heaven. Then we have in South Arabian, which is distinct from the Arabic languages actually and cultures. Nonetheless have Altar Sharikon, so Shining Star of Dawn. And there's kind of a complex here that anyone can look into a little bit more. I've just put some names down here. So another little piece of information here is in Ugaritic we have both Othtar as the god of Venus, and he's featured in a story there in the Ball cycle of attempting to usurp heaven in a sense and drowning in his chariot in the sea. The Ebelite form of him, Ashtabil, is also more of a subservient sort of deity rather than a high god, like, say, the Assyrians or also the Arabians. I forgot to mention, this is their high god. This is their most important deity, Atar, through most of their pagan history before Islam. But there is another dawn deity whose name literally means dawn, or the shining first, or the first light, basically. And that's Shakar, and that's a name that's Shahar is also used in Hebrew to refer to dawn, and it's where Hillel ben Shahar comes from, bright lord of dawn. And this is actually the same exact phrasing that is given to Othtar actually in Ugaritic sources as Othtar of dawn or Othtar of Shahar. But Shahar is said by the Ugaritic to be an actual deity. He's a twin of Shalim, and they're both born basically representing the east, dawn, and the west, dusk. They are born on a beach with what seems to be two mortals with Enlil, or El. Othtar is said to be the son of Dawn, that he's literally son of Shakar. So it's implied that Venus is the son of Dawn and that they are not the same deity. So that's a little complication here, but nonetheless, I'm charting the Dawn gods. These are both Dawn gods. I also want to mention this goddess here, Athir, is supposedly another name for Atharat, which again is Asherah. The difference between Sh and Th is kind of wishy-washy in Ugaritic Northwestern Semitic. Nonetheless, At is a feminine form, and this would be a theoretically masculine or neutral form if it was indeed a Phoenician deity. And I used to have the kind of assumption, and maybe it's wrong, that Aether, the Greek Aether, which is a very old sky god, or the first god basically, whose name means light, it means bright, the same as Athir, Ashir means shining. When you kind of look up the definition, it'll say walker, but these I think is kind of a folk etymology having to do with Asherah or Atharat walking the beach. There's a lot of Asherah, Atharat that is a basis of Aphrodite, being a beach-bound dawn goddess. So moving down back into Lower Sumer may be where this deity originated from. Like, what's the possible oldest form? If we're just kind of ignoring the ancient Venus god or goddess or deity, that was probably common to all. If we're looking at specific characteristics, then this is where maybe those would have come from. There was essentially a triangle of confusion here between Ishtaran, Inshushinak, and Asalui. Which one of these was the first form? We don't know. We don't know if this god of the dawn and justice and order and judgment is based or originated with the Sumerians, with Asarluhi, whose name essentially means shining star or shining lord. Luhi, like Lugal, is one of the king forms or names in Sumerian. Gal means great, so Lugal means shining great. Then there's Inshushinak, that is, his name literally means the lord of Susa. And Susa is the capital, basically, of the Elamites, Susians in this region. They are essentially a Neolithic Iranian substrate. He is a bit more chthonic than in the West, which is very interesting. And some of his roles, like as of judgment over the dead, are similar to what would later become aspects of Mithra, which we'll talk about later. Ishtaran still, of course, could possibly be the basis of either of these. It could be still that the Akkadians coming in to influence Sumerians and Elamites, spread their dawn god. The reason that's not, I don't think, the most believable, in my opinion, is that the Elamites had him as their primary deity. Or Iranian Neolithic farmers is like a very ancient group. The Sumerians seem to have always been there, maybe more of a southerly route or origin. Basal-Eurasian, perhaps. The Semites came down to this region. So my bet is that it actually came from Elamite. And here's some more evidence for that. I mentioned that Inshushinak was a little chthonic, which kind of tips you off at also being very old. A lot of old deities are chthonic, especially Neolithically based ones. Ender Saga is the Sumerian Night Watchman. And this Night Watchman isn't necessarily always chthonic in the underworld, although it later became more associated with that, kind of a Hades-like vibe. Originally, they would actually walk cities and towns and villages at night to protect against monsters and demons, basically. So it was a deity that would manifest himself. He had a staff with a lamp on it. So he was indeed a torch bearer or a light bearer in general, patrolling for the good of a social and spiritual order. He also, at some point, gets an association with a rooster, and we will talk about more deities associated with roosters in this complex later in this video. So that would honestly be my guess of where he originally maybe came from, which is kind of an interesting concept, the concept of a night watchman. And also I mentioned that the Elamite is a substrate in later Zoroastrian Iranian religion. So we can see Rashnu having potential aspects as a judge of the dead, like in Shushinak, and as a judge and a rationer, like Ishtaran is. Because Ishtaran also associated with scales, so the zodiac sign Libra is basically based on these dawn god and goddess complexes. It's another reason that I use astrology a lot in my organization of things. It's kind of the fundamental place I started with because the patterns were kind of irresistible. So Rashnu seems to be a direct, perhaps, import of Ishtaran into Zoroastrian religion. Ashur of the Assyrians. He was mostly syncretized with Anu, and in fact with Anu's parent, or Anu's father, Anshar, whose name means whole heaven. Anu is essentially equivalent to the Greek Ornos or Uranus. The cycle is Uranus, Kronos, and Zeus. In the Middle East, that cycle with Babylonian is Anu, Enlil, and Marduk. Right, so that's like the cycle of heavenly kings in their history. When the Assyrians inherited the kind of Akkadian pantheon. Their patron deity of their capital, Ashur, had some warrior and justice and kind of civic aspects to him. He's much more grounded than you would expect a sky god like Anu or Uranus would be. I colored Ashur blue, my representation of a sky god archetype, and I would consider that archetype slightly separate from this dawn god archetype that we're building in pink, because I think he mostly sits on the side of being more of an Anu type sky god figure, even though there is a potential overlap with Ishtaran and this shining god complex. So the last aspect of this Ishtaran type I would like to talk about up here in Anatolia and the Caucasus region. The only deity in here that is unquestionably derived from Ishtaran in Mesopotamia is Ashtabi, which is derived from Ashtabil in Ebla when the Hurrians conquered Syria. But there are two other forms of this astral, heavenly, shining deity that may or may not be influenced one way or another by him. To the left, towards Hatti and Hittite, and eventually Caucasian, Kartvelian, and Georgian sources, there is a solar deity with this shining linguistic, but is referring to the sun itself as the shining object of heaven. And that, of course, that makes sense coincidentally that that would be the same sounding name as the shining star, because the sun is a star ultimately. At the other side on the right here, with more Armenian or Urartian, there is a deity with this linguistic that might have more to do with stars or with the astral or celestial heavenly realm in general, because ultimately he evolved into the Armenian term for God proper during the Christian era. And that potentially, although this isn't proven, could also be a influence on the Hungarian word for God and their great god. Hungarian is, of course, a Ugrian or a Finno-Ugric culture and language that came from this region and eventually blended with a lot of Indo-European steppe cultures and then migrated into Europe to become to settle down in Hungary today. During that period, during that kind of medieval period, is when I think they might have inherited the Armenian or other Caucasian generic term name for the Christian God and used that or part of that to describe their high god. But it's also possible that they inherited this high god idea from an shining sort of linguistic in Proto-Indo-European, or just the Indo-European worshiping a god of the east, a god of the shining, or maybe even a god of the sky in general. Maybe it is a little closer to this Eston Hatic core of like the shining heavens being another word for this sun. And this shares a lot of ideas with the idea of the sun as a watcher, as an eye. Nonetheless, the possible origin to this Armenian god proper might be in Urartian and Subarian. So the Subarians were kind of in this intersection area between the Assyrians and Urartu. And Urartu is basically Armenia. It's the homeland of the Armenians. This entire region with these three lakes is Urartu effectively. It has been proven already that Hurrian and Urartian are related languages, that effectively the Hurrians, when they migrated back out of Syria, became the Urartians. And the Urartians are then a substrate, a non-Indo-European, purely substrate of Armenian. So all of these deities, Astuvanu is kind of a mysterious, important high god of Subarians. may have been some relationship to this Ashur figure, this kind of combination of shining and astral celestial king, because they were in such close contact. It could also be a much older stem. Nonetheless, there becomes this term of the shining or astral spirit, Astiuzi, and there is a treaty between the Hittites and early Urartians where a god is referenced, Unagastas, as kind of a treaty covenant guarantor. And Astas, Astuas, literally evolves into this Armenian term. He has aspects, therefore, of a Mithras or a just covenant type deity. So that's part of why I have him in this chart in general. But of course, he's part of a evolution into this generic heavenly deity. A bit of complication here. You know, the heavenly or the Venus or the solar are competing for a general archetype here. Ishtaran over here is another confusing phenomenon because he's associated with the sun itself and is also said to be at nighttime traveling through the underworld, particularly the watery underworld associated with lakes. I'd like to mention a mythic motif that's quite interesting when we're talking about this solar or Venus god and the sea or waters, and maybe even a chthonic aspect to this solar or Venus deity. The myth of Othtar in Ugaritic is he attempts to usurp Baal as king of the heavens, and he's too small for the throne. He doesn't fit, and he falls from the sky in his chariot, either into the underworld or into the sea. And after that point, he is considered to be a king of the sea or the underworld, which is quite interesting because this motif is very much shared or implied to be shared in the Judaic Hillel ben Shahar, the basis of the Christian Lucifer, who is, as we established, basically equivalent of Othtar. He fell from heaven and became ruler of the underworld in some sense. Now, Lucifer also has other influences that we will talk about with Phosphorus, Eros, and so on. But this motif shows up also in the story of Phaethon. So Phaethon is the son of Helios, the sun, and represents Venus. And there's a story where Phaethon tries to ride Helios's chariot, and he fails to control it, and he falls down into a river and drowns, presumably. Phaethon is considered to be another symbolic basis to Lucifer. And with that, we basically have the Ishtaran-Ishtar complex here. So I'm going to bring one of the layers I have here back in to be visible. And this is my super old proto layer. I'm calling it Ace or Aish as a West Asian shining form of a deity. Seems to have or probably existed during the West Asian Neolithic and referred to potentially the shining star Venus and or the shining heavens, whether that is again the sun or just the sky itself. It could be the basis of any one of these ish ash sounding words or names. I'm going to focus on the most potential ones and the ones that seem the most ancient and old. Ashur kind of implies as the astral god something that could be that old. Astavads that we were looking at could be there too. Asman is also the name for the heavens or the sky, sometimes considered a deity. In Zoroastrianism, also considered the first deity created by Ahura Mazda, which then resembles the first deity Aether in the Greek sources, and also the Anshar Ashur idea we were talking about of a deity being even before Anu. So that's another really interesting correlation there between Ashur And Aether is also before Uranus. He is a sky astral air bright shining deity that's considered to have existed and been the parent of Uranus and Gaia, like even older than the Titans, right? One interesting case is down here with the Berber or Amazigh high god or most important god of the Libyans. Now, the Libyans were originally spoken of by the Greeks and the Egyptians before them as a Berber people that lived in Libya and in this whole Maghreb region. They're linguistically closely related to Egyptians. Linguists used to, a long time ago, refer to them both as Hamitic, referring to Ham as like the Western migrant brother of Shem, Shem's supposedly the ancestor of the Semites, right? So Eastern Afro-Asiatic and Western Afro-Asiatic languages. But the Egyptians even referred to the Libyans as a different people, and they lived in the Siwa Oasis and other oases here in the west. Their primary deity was said to be Ash, whose name seems to be Shining or Watcher, and again we are talking about the Watcher as being like the sun or the shining eye in the sky, very Ra sounding. They still distinguished him from Ra and from their own gods, interestingly. Nonetheless, they have a form of Ash, which is Shu, and Shu is a primordial deity, one of the first deities to come into existence, and is specifically shown holding up the sky. So he's something of a sky pillar or a cosmic man. And that's a very interesting symbol because we also know through the Greeks of a Berber Amazigh god, Atlash, who was associated with the Atlas Mountains. These are the Atlas Mountains. And the Greeks reported that he was the basis of their own Atlas. That Atlas in the west is reported, of course, to be upholding the western sky as a sky pillar. The Greeks themselves said that Atlas was a Berber deity originally, that they adopted him. And this is another implication that this idea of Atlas and Atlantis is a Berber thing. And most of the hypotheses right now about where Atlantis would have been if it was a thing at all are Berber regions. And that stretches anywhere from right here, potentially Lake Tritonis or another lake. And I've had a little bit of a suspicion about this region for a while because it used to be quite green and very nice, and then desertified massively during the Bronze and Iron Ages. Would have been devastating for the culture here. The other hypotheses to where Atlantis might be is beyond the Pillars of Hercules. There are a bunch of islands here settled by Berber peoples who eventually were called the Guanche before the Spanish unfortunately came in and spread their religion. Then the other more crazy but still interesting hypothesis would be the Eye of the Sahara, which is more down here. Nonetheless, all of those areas are within the Maghreb, the greater Maghreb region, and so either way, I think the Greeks were correct that Atlas and Atlantis were Berber in some sense. Atlas is often referred to as like a mountain god or the word for the mountain itself, but that Ash word in there and being an important Berber deity according to the Egyptians implies that there might have been some commonality of the watcher on the mountain perhaps, or the watcher above. Ashaman or Akman is the high god of the Guanche, preserving that same linguistic and that same idea, and he's a heavenly sky god looking down, watching down upon all the people and providing for them when they need it. Very similar to the Amazigh Yakuk, who's basically their high god, and his name means giver, the giver. And Ashaman is reported to have given the Berbers cattle and other kinds of things, implying again a more Neolithic origin to his lordship potentially. But we can see with all of these there is no longer any sort of Eastern association of this term or this idea. It is not explicitly solar either. It is more astral and just heavenly in general, very much resembling the Asman in Zoroastrian that we're talking about, and Ashur to an extent in Assyria, and Aether over in Greece, would imply a very old kind of astral figure. Now, Atlas is associated with the Western pillar that upholds the world. He inherits this job from Iapetus, who's another Titan, slightly older than him, and also Astraeus, who is another Titan older than him as well. And Astraeus' name means the starry one. In this case, it refers to the west rather than the east. Now, of course, the west is associated often with the evening star, which is, as we know, the same star as the morning star, as Venus. The opposite of Astraeus and Iapetus in the west is Hyperion in the east. And Hyperion in the Greek sources is a solar god. He's the father of the sun and the moon, and even Eos, the dawn goddess. So it implies that he's a very ancient deity, almost transcending the sun itself. Nonetheless, he has more solar aspects. His name means high one, and he's often treated in that same kind of way as Istanu, Estan, and even Astuas is, as this like high god. The east can be associated with the sun, the rising sun in general, as well as with the rising star of Venus. Kepri is another example of that. He's associated with the rising sun and has many kind of rainbow transformative aspects that we are going to see with a few other dawn gods. And then the final idea here I wanted to cover, because it is so relevant linguistically, is this very old term for a heavenly god led to a general term for gods, plural. So a group of gods is often referred to by many religions as shining ones and shining gods, shining spirits, shining stars. Indo-Iranian sources, we have the Ahuras, Zoroastrianism, and the Asuras in Vedic. They're basically demonized in Vedic Hindu sources, and they're basically sanctified in Zoroastrian sources. The hypothesis currently is that they both stem from an Indo-Iranian source that started with the Proto-Indo-European reconstructed term Hasuras, which is a word for lords, but the Hash part is ultimately originally shining. The general hypothesis for where the Aesir, the name from the Norse gods, come from is to be Ansus, which is life force. And really life force and shining ones and all of that could be a big complex of like what a deity or what deification kind of looked or sounded like. But we also have, coincidentally or not, the Etruscan name for the gods, which also means the light ones or light beings. And the Etruscans, of course, are a non-Indo-European culture. Also, in the case of the Ahuras, they are specifically in Zoroastrianism opposed to the Devas, and Devas is in many ways basis in Judeo-Christian religion for devils, because Semitic faiths also demonized the Devas, the divas, that in Hinduism are considered good. A lot of the Ahuras, like Ahura Mazda and Mithra even, seem to have been taken from or evolved from pre-Indo-European sources, so like native Iranian Neolithic peoples, related to the Elamites, as I was saying earlier. And my hypothesis is that the Devas represent the incoming Indo-Aryan gods, and the Ahuras, Asuras represent the native gods that were already there. And if that is the case, this is not true, that the Asuras is not Proto-Indo-European. If the Asuras did not come from Proto-Indo-European, then how do we get the Aesir and the Norse? Well, that's a whole episode unto itself, but long story short, my hypothesis is that the name for these Shining Ones gods is a Neolithic name. It's something that started down here in Anatolia and spread throughout Europe with the early European farmers, which meant that it ended up being the name for the Aesir gods in Norse that they preserved even after Indo-European influence, and it was the name for the Etruscan gods that they preserved even after the Italian Indo-European people came into Italy, and was the name for the Iranian and Indian layer of gods that were there already during the Neolithic. So a little different from the dawn god proper, but still potentially interesting. Okay, so it's finally time for Mithra. Let me turn his layer on and make this even more complicated. Mithra, traditionally and in general, considered to have come from Iranian or Indo-Iranian sources. He shows up as an Asura in Vedic Mitra and as an Ahura in Iranian and Zoroastrian as Mithra. We, of course, have all these different Iranian-derived names for him. In general, his name means oath, sometimes friend, sometimes covenant, or contract. It's all an interrelated concept of order through oath or covenant with the people or with a tribe or with an alliance. In general, that kind of has to do with diplomacy, if I were to broaden that term. Some interesting outlying places that he shows up are in Armenian and Hurrian mythology. A really important part of the Hurrian story is the Mitanni is the name for the alliance of the Hurrians that they ruled their region in Upper Mesopotamia. The Mitanni is related to Mitra and Mithra as a term for the alliance or the friendship in a way, the fellowship, you might even say. It is hypothesized, and this is probably true, that at the very least the upper class of the Hurrians and the Mitanni were Indo-Aryan steppe charioteers. The spoked wheel chariot, which was the most compatible with warfare and with using horses in warfare, came from this region here, this Shintashta culture, which was kind of a proto-Indo-Aryan culture, and they came down into this region, of course. Around the time that they were heading down here is around the time the Hurrians show up. Given that Urartian is kind of a non-Indo-European substrate of Armenian language, we might even consider this to have been the origin of the very oldest elements of the Armenian people, being a mix of the Hurrians, Urartians living there, and an upper class or a warrior class of Indo-Aryans coming in and mixing with them. Of course, there's linguistic elements of the Armenian language that are not purely Indo-Aryan. There's elements that are more compatible with Greek, so that's a whole other story. Nonetheless, that's an important piece of the puzzle here because the Hurrians worshipped both Ashtabi that they adopted from the Syrians and Mitrasil, who they adopted from the Indo-Aryans. And I mentioned earlier the Unagastas Treaty as being kind of an alliance or a covenant, a diplomatic deity that was referred to, might have had aspects of Mitra. Another outlier in the Caucasus region is the later medieval Christian hero, St. George, namesake of Georgia, is hypothesized to have many aspects of Mithra, being a white horseman, heroic figure representing covenants and oaths, and something of a heavenly warrior of righteousness and justice. Some of his names, Wasgirgi and Dizrag in Svanetian and Ossetian is a Scythian language, by the way. Svanetian is more related to Garvelian. These names and deities were treated during the early Christianization effort. The pagans of the countryside worshipped these, where the Christians would think they were worshiping St. George, yet all the aspects of the hero seem to be pagan in origin. And Mithra is the most likely origin. And then going along with the idea that Mithra, if he was an Asura, was probably a pre-Indo-European deity in the region. My hypothesis for this, or my guess for this, is something I discovered in Semitic mythology. This character here, Misharu, and his Phoenician variant Misor. That name, Misharu, Misor, means upright or measurer. The terminology of being upright or straight or measured or balanced or level is all related. Again, it relates to that Ishtaran idea of the Libra or the scales of keeping balance, and so there's an aspect of justice there and fairness. I thought it's interesting that Misharu and Mithra are almost like the same word morphologically. if Mithra were to be translated into Akkadian, it would be Misharu. Yet the meaning of the terms is different. And I wonder if they might have had some influence on one another. We do know that the Sabarians and Urartians were present around the 3rd millennium when the Akkadian Empire was getting a start. They were very loosely present up north in the Urartu region, and if there was any kind of Mitra-like character, perhaps it came from there or went to there from this deity of justice and measurement. Another coincidence with this linguistic and meaning and character, I want to point out a few over here in Irish and Norse as Midir and Mithodin. The meaning of the words is the same. They're a judge and stem from that kind of measurer idea that is the same as in Akkadian. And that makes me wonder if there was some judge term that spread out from the Middle East, maybe during the Neolithic or maybe Bronze Age, unless when these myths are being written down by the Irish or Norse, maybe it was medieval period and these terms were adopted from Roman or other sources. Midir was a judge and a king in the Irish pantheon, and he was considered handsome and the father of Lear and stepfather of Angus, which is interesting because we're going to talk about Angus in a moment. He also lost one of his eyes, and in Mithodin in Norse sources is also very interesting and oddly important because he, of all the gods, sometimes stood in for Odin in Asgard when Odin was wandering the world. And this is the same thing that Odin's twin brothers Vili and Ve do. So Vili, Ve, and this mysterious Mithodin sometimes stood in for Odin as king of the gods. And that sounds like a very important place to be. And given that he was a measurer, a judge, and he was considered reasonable and a master of fate, sometimes even associated with Yggdrasil in particular, and was also a partner of Frigga, there's certainly a Mithra-like flavor to all of that that I've always wondered about. Another curious, interesting idea here is Mithra as the judge of the dead. This is how he's treated in Zoroastrian pantheon, and in this part again resembles kind of this Ishum, Inshushinak, Ender Saga complex going on here. But also, oddly enough, over here in Crete, so the Greeks referred to the Minoans as having 3 judges of the dead, who judged the dead, determining whether their soul would go to Elysian, Asphodel, or Tartarus. They are Minos, King Minos, and he would be kind of the deciding vote between Aeacus, who was more of the scribe, judging the soul of Westerners and Europeans, and Rhadamanthus, who judged the souls of Easterners and Asians when they died. So when they're referring to Asians and Easterners, they're referring to Asia is Anatolia and really the Middle East and Iran and everything east of Crete and Greece. And everything west of Crete and Greece, these Western Europeans and also Berbers and whatnot, you have that dynamic there. You have a similar figure to Mithra representing the East and the Eastern peoples in Asia in general. And he also is described and named as having a rod or staff wielding prophet. And that, to me, it just screamed of this Ishum, rod wielding Lord of the Scepter, torchbearer, underworld, original Night Watchman figure. If it was really a Minoan thing, maybe that source is Neolithic, since the Minoans and Aedo-Cretans were non-Indo-European, or maybe it was a later import of a kind of mythical motif from the East in the Mediterranean much later. Speaking of later Mediterranean influence, mostly speaking out the Hellenic period after the Alexandrian conquests, there's a few really interesting deities and angels and personalities here that we definitely have to mention that bridge together a lot of these influences and kind of syncretize them into important personalities. We've already mentioned kind of Lucifer before. Someone in the Judeo-Christian tradition that very much resembles Mithra, for instance, is Michael. And Michael, kind of like St. George, is this heroic heavenly warrior, white horseman who fights all the other demonic devil gods and attempts to supplant them with Yahweh or El or whatever the heck you want to call their conflated god. Although the linguistics behind Michael is said to be who is like El, as a sort of challenge to any god who tries to usurp him, that he will destroy them, as effectively the implication of that. Nonetheless, a lot of the angelic philosophy in Judeo-Christian religion is indeed influenced by Zoroastrianism during a pretty short period of the Babylonian exile and afterwards. As we can see, the Babylonian exile was actually quite short. It lasted from 597 to 538 BC. It was within a century. But still enough, a lot of scholars recognize that the Zoroastrian dualistic religion influenced a lot of early Judaic scripture, because obviously the scriptures weren't written really until after the exile or during it. So I can't help but see a potential influence from Mithra or Misha. He certainly represents a lot of those aspects, and like we talked about with the Asuras being in contrast to the Devas and the angels being enemies of devils, there is a very similar dynamic going on. Another aspect of Michael that might have been involved is Malak Bel, the messenger of Bel or Baal, or perhaps just the messenger god, the messenger lord. Malak eventually becomes the Hebrew term for angel as a subservient entity to the high god, but the linguistic originally stems from another kingly term of Malak, which is just a term for a king or a lord. So funny enough, we have a deity whose name essentially means Lord. We also see that probably stemming to influence a lot of what would become Melek Taus in the Yazidic Gnostic religion. So Yazidism is a Gnostic faith that kind of branched off from Judeo-Christian religion and took on Greek Gnostic elements, and also as a Kurdish religion took on many Zoroastrian and Manichaean aspects. Melek Taus is the leader of the angels and is represented by a peacock and by rainbows. His name means messenger peacock or angel peacock or the peacock angel. Relative to the Gnostic framing, which usually treats the demiurge or the creator of the world as demonic or evil, the Yazidis treat him, demiurge, as good, as chosen by God to create the world, and that the world is not necessarily this dualistic place. It's not, at least in Yazidi religion, treated quite that way like a lot of other Gnostic religions and Abrahamic religions do treat it. There's an aspect of him that probably also stems from another Gnostic religion, a Mandaean religion. Yushamin is Lord of Heaven, and it kind of goes back to implying that Autar, Lord of Heaven, or Autar of Heaven. But really, a lot of deities could be called of Heaven. Yu is a reference to Yahweh or Yao, just the general term of God eventually. Yushaman is associated with peacocks as well as Melek Taus is, so most certainly is a origin for him. A big difference between Yushamin and Melek Taus is demonization. Yushamin is more of a Luciferian kind of devil character. He wished to create his own world, and he prayed to the high god to grant him the power to do so, but he was rejected, and so he rebelled against the first lives created by the high creator and created a dark world, which is our world. And this, of course, is a very Manichaean, Zoroastrian influenced idea, but taking in a lot of Levantine, Semitic, and Abrahamic deities, turning them into angels and demons. We even have in Mandaean sources Ptah showing up as Ptahil, the Egyptian creator demiurge. So yes, we have this kind of rainbow creator demiurge of light who is banished, very Luciferian. Very quickly, some of these motifs and symbols very much resemble the Hindu Dravidian deity Kartikaya Murugan. He's a war god primarily, but represents heroism and wrath and justice and also youth. He's associated with roosters and peacocks. And he fights demons. So just thought I'd bring that up really quick. Feel free to look into it more. And now to bridge together a few of these different ideas, let's go back to the Mediterranean with Phaethon, a fallen Venus deity. There's a fundamentally important Orphic Greek deity, Phanes, or his other name is Protagonist, meaning he's the first god. And we've mentioned the first god motif quite a few times, especially in relation to the more old and ancient forms like Aether, Ash, or Shu, Ashur, and Ashman, and even in Norse, Buri kind of fits that bill. Purusha, also in Vedic, kind of fits the bill, from which all other beings emanate. This emanation of all other beings relates to Melektos a bit as well, because his rainbow association implies that all the different facets, all the different deities of the world are emanations of him. He's himself kind of similar to Ahura Mazda and all of his emanations. In later kind of Greek philosophical sources, during more Gnostic periods, Aether is spoken of like this. There is a more clear divide between gods that descend from Aether, who are considered light gods, light beings, and gods that descend from Nyx, that are considered more dark. So the Orphic tradition is also kind of a later tradition. It's implied that it's old because it takes from Phrygian, and Phrygian was in Anatolia, and Anatolia was very old, like Kybele and whatnot, that we do kind of treat as a remnant of a very old Anatolian Neolithic mythology, perhaps, which I talk about in my Kybele video. When it comes to the Orphic tradition, a lot of the original first primordial deities, like Phanes, like Eurynome, like Ophion, seem to be later evolutions of potentially early concepts, but they're more abstracted, philosophical in nature. It's almost like the difference between the Rig Veda and the Upanishads, an original source and a philosophical retelling of that source or reinterpretation of that source. So part of the reason that I think Phanes is mostly a later period Greek character, despite probably having some old remnants, is because his name means the same thing as the Ptolemaic Egyptian god Bennu. And Bennu is, the Bennu bird. It's considered the Egyptian phoenix. And the Greek phoenix, as we see here, called purple because its color was considered this purpley red thing. A lot of times purple was seen as red, and sometimes even more in the orange, and at the most kind of burgundy. And of course, during this Greek period, a lot of times green and blue were not treated as different colors, so we can't get too wedded to exactly what these colors mean. It's the same reason they called the Phoenicians what they did, is because they had purple dye, and it was just the people of the purple dye, the purple people. They called this bird phoenix because of its particular color, but the Egyptian term originally was Weben, which does mean beaming, which is why I think we see Phanes described as originating from a cosmic egg guarded by Ophion the serpent, and he's bright and emanating, and all the other gods basically emanate from him. That's also, to some degree, what the Bennu bird represented Egypt. He was a crane, landed on the first piece of land, the first island, and began to direct the creation of the world. So in some ways, Bennu is a demiurge. He's originally described, again, as kind of a heron, but eventually takes on rainbow coloration. And this he shares in some ways with Khepri, who sometimes Khepri is seen as like the emerging dawn created being, which is interesting that they overlap but are different. The idea of a phoenix being more like a flying eagle-like creature and having fiery connotations is seemingly a Greek idea and not a native Egyptian idea. The whole phoenix archetype is a whole video unto itself that we also would have to talk about, a lot of Eastern Feng Wang and such. But for now, just understand this all kind of works together into a dawn god mentality of dawn being creation, the dawn of creation. We have Abraxas, who is a Gnostic, very important figure. He's the one depicted with a rooster head and serpent legs, usually manning a chariot. His name is an acronym, but also might itself mean Father Son Seer or Father Son Watcher. So again, it's got that kind of meaning of Osh and the Watcher and the stuff that we keep coming across motif. So now that we've gotten officially to the rooster, I mentioned it with Ender Saga a little bit, and then we just went over to Kartikaya. Obviously, a rooster is associated with dawn because a rooster crows at dawn. The Eastern Phoenix, which is the Feng Huang, actually has aspects of a rooster. It has aspects of many animals, but also a rooster. The rooster is technically native to Southeast Asia, and as a domestic animal, it was traded westward over time. So ultimately, all of those motifs and deities would have been inherited in some way or form, potentially from the East, where roosters themselves came from. And that's talking about Neolithic period. That's talking very old. All right, going forward, I think I'm gonna just have to cut these up into different episodes. I have been sitting here filming for hours. And finally, we are getting to the last archetype or set of motifs that I want to bring up in the Dawn God investigation. And these all play to the idea of youth and love. And of course, that would be Eros and Cupid. And I have here the many Etruscan versions of Cupid and Amor. Eros, Cupid, usually depicted as like a child with a bow, represents dawn and is son of the dawn goddess Aphrodite or Venus. But he has an older form, and that is Phosphoros or Eosphoros, and that's the son of Eos. And so again, we have, like I mentioned in the dawn goddess video, Eos and Aphrodite and Venus all kind of operating as the same dawn goddess archetype at different stages of Greek mythology, probably due to different migrational influences. Nonetheless, Phosphoros, meaning Lightbringer, is the literal basis of the Latin Lucifer that has been related back to Hallel bin Shahar, and coincidentally lines up with it quite a lot. So this is something that probably got put together in that same Gnostic period we were talking about. So Phosphoros is associated with dawn and the east, and there is a general large set of deities in many mythologies that are associated with east as a direction, and often dawn and the morning star alongside it. One of these would be Auster, the Roman wind god of the east. His linguistic comes back to this os root, and it is where our own word east comes from. So we see here in the Baltic mythology, we have Osteros and Oseklis, and these are gods of the eastern wind and children of the dawn goddess Osirene. There is a little story. He tries to swim in the Baltic Ocean, and the wind god Bangbutis tries to drown him, and I thought that was kind of funny because it almost sounded like the dawn god falling into the sea motif. And there's another obscure character up here, a love god, and again the Eros, often a love deity. Osteros himself is kind of a love child in Baltic mythology. Leminki is this love child as well, and he dies tragically in the underworld river, and his mother deity, I think, is trying to search for him in the water. This resembles the Phaethon myth where Cygnus, his best friend, was trying to fish him out of the water or find his remains in the water. Due to his dedication, he was transformed into a Cygnus swan in the constellation. He devolves, in a sense, due to Christian influence in the Finnish religion, into Lempo, which is kind of like a lust demon. Anyhow, we have another Os deity in Norse, implied to be very old by being a dwarf. They're the four dwarves that are holding up the four pillars of the world. So this is basically equivalent to the Greek, Hyperion and Iaptis and Koius and Crius. In Norse, the east is Austri. There's another love deity up here, Skirnir, and coincidentally he means shining one. And he's a little obscure, he only really shows up in a few stories, like in the story of trying to marry Frey and Gertha. There's also an obscure hero by the name of Arvandil, or Vandalus in Germanic and Norse and even Old English as Erendel. His name means shining wanderer. It's the basis of the character Erendil in Tolkien mythology, an ancestor of Aragorn. There's an obscure deity in Gaul as well I wanted to mention, Abgatiacus. And at first when I saw him and saw that he had rooster features, I thought that he was maybe Abraxas, but in further inspection, the linguistics seems to be related to a area or region, Abgatius, and he is the spirit of that area and is a syncretism of potentially Lugh and Hermes or Mercury, because Lugh is often associated with a rooster because Lugh represents in some ways also the rising sun of Loki, also associated with rooster. Both Lugh and Loki are essentially Lucifer, but I have not brought them into this because I think they're a bit more complex. That Lugh was misassociated by the Romans with Hermes, even though Lugh really is a lot more similar to Apollo and Soranus as a proper sun god. So this rooster got attached to this deity, and this deity was given a lot of hermetic features, and so it ended up looking like the hermetic Abraxas, right? We have these Yarosov and Jatrenka and Jutrabog, Slavic youth deities, and often they are given kind of heroic things to do. You know, Yarovit, young hero as well. Yarlo is this twin youth god that fights demons, does a lot of the same kinds of things that Mithra would be doing, but he's depicted younger and often on a horseback. There's essentially spring twins in Baltic and Slavic mythology. They are Vesnik and Vesna, Vesna being the female spring goddess, Vesnik being the male. And then there's over here with the Coop linguistics, there's Kupolo and Kupoli. So with this cupola and possibly even Cupid, there is a similar common meaning that I discovered with desire is what Cupid means in Roman, and in Balto-Slavic there's a slight difference between the Lithuanian and the Russian interpretation. The Russian interpretation is it's kind of a word for bathing, and in the Lithuanian interpretation it's kind of a name for copious or like being full, abundant. And the hypothesis is that this word for copious and bathing might actually have something to do with boiling, and that your desires, your passions are boiling, essentially. There is no exact Kup deity in more Eastern Indo-European. However, there is Kama, who is identical to Eros and Cupid in many ways, and whose name also means desire, but is slightly different. Kama versus Cupid, or Kupala. And we even see in Tocharian A and B Kamkat or Kamnakte, who's proven as the love god, the god of desire in Tocharian mythology. And you could go back and think, oh my god, that must be some sort of Indo-European ancient root. But by the time that these were being referenced, there had already been Buddhist influence in Tocharia, moving eastward into China. So this is thought to be derived from Kama, actually, in India. Then, as far as we're talking about beautiful male youths and heroes, we have Macon, or Maponos, or Mabon, or Angus Og. I remember mentioning Midir adopted him. He is something of the Eros, or the youthful, heroic god of Celtic mythology. He evolves in a sense into Arthurian and Shakespearean characters. Oberon, something of like an elf or a king of fairies, because of his beauty, purity, and immortal youth. Then a character that kind of resembles Mithra in some ways, but has a dark aspect, is this mysterious Briogan Bress character, showing up in 3 different areas as a white horseman, high god, important to the Gauls, it seems, as a counterpart to Brigantia, a basis of Brigid. Briogan is one of the invaders of the Galicians, the Milesians that comes to take over the Irish. Bress is a very similar character that nonetheless is often treated as different from Briogan. The Irish treat him as something of a corrupt king, though he is beautiful, and that's an interesting take on the concept. Interesting demonification going on there. And with that, I think we've covered basically everything. I covered a lot of ground here. It took a good long while to do so. I have stuck to West Asia for the most part. I hope that at least some of this was illuminating or helpful for you and your own researches. I'll see you in the next one.